Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture, which is going to be very short, we are going to go over something that seems really straightforward, but is actually really tricky for most English speakers, which is when to use unidirectional versus multidirectional verbs of motion. And this is actually going to be, like I said, a really short lecture because I'm just going to give you a few tips to kind of get you started on the topic. And one can talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about it, but that's not necessarily super helpful in the beginning. So let's just go over a few simple tips, and then you can start looking at examples. The textbook has a lot of great examples, and so I recommend that once you listen to this lecture, you start looking at the examples and working on the exercises in the textbook. Let's start with unidirectional motion. Remember, those are verbs like идти, ехать, лететь, бежать, вести, вести, нести. We use unidirectional motion, these unidirectional verbs of motion, when we want to indicate that motion is in progress towards a specific goal. For instance, we could say «Я сейчас иду в библиотеку». Right now, I'm going to the library. The motion is currently in progress, and we have a specific goal mentioned, and we have no discussion, no indication of return. I mean, probably you are going to come home from the library at some point, but that is not the point of that sentence. The point of that sentence is to say that right now I am going to the library, and that's what we're focusing on. Another example could be «Куда ты едешь? Я еду домой». Where are you going? I'm going home. Again, you see someone. Maybe they're riding on the bus, maybe you see them in the car, and you stop to talk to them as they're stopped at a stoplight or something, and you ask them, «Куда ты едешь?» Where are you going right now? You're interested in where they're going at the moment, not where they're going in general, and not whether or not they're coming back. You're interested in their specific goal that they're currently in progress towards. And they say, «Я еду домой». I'm going home. Again, they're indicating motion in progress towards a specific goal. They will probably leave their home at some point, but that is not what interests us. What interests us is where they're going right now. Those two examples were in the present, but we can also use these in the past or the future. And an example in the past would be «Я шла в магазин, когда я вдруг увидела Максима». I was walking to the store when I suddenly saw Maxime. And probably at this point, you're no longer at the store. You probably left the store and came home, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that at the moment when you were walking towards the store, so there was motion in progress towards a specific goal, you suddenly saw Maxime. And the suddenly seeing Maxime happened while you were engaged in unidirectional motion towards a specific goal. So that is how that works. Most of the time, you're going to use these unidirectional verbs of motion to indicate one trip, but you can also use them to indicate repeated motion. Remember, they are imperfective, so they can indicate repeated actions. And so if you have some kind of repeated motion in one direction, you will use a unidirectional verb of motion even though it's repeated and even though you're also coming home, but we're not talking about that. If you are indicating motion towards a specific goal, and you're only interested in that leg of the trip, you're going to use a unidirectional verb of motion. For instance, каждую среду я иду в университет пешком и еду домой на автобусе. Every Wednesday, I go to campus on foot, or I walk to campus, and I ride home on the bus. And so this is a round trip, but each leg of the trip is done differently and described differently, and each leg of the trip is unidirectional, so we're going to use a unidirectional verb of motion to describe each leg of the trip because there is motion in progress towards a specific goal. Каждую среду я иду в университет пешком и еду домой на автобусе. What about multidirectional motion? Multidirectional motion can indicate either a single round trip or repeated round trips. So if we are using it in the past tense, it can indicate a single round trip because even though it's just one trip, it had two legs, you went there and you went back. For example, вчера я ходила на концерт. Yesterday I went to a concert, and that indicates that I went to the concert and I came back. Or на прошлой неделе я ездила в Нью-Йорк. Last week I went to New York. I'm not in New York anymore. I'm back home. I made a single round trip, and so I used a multidirectional verb of motion. We can also use these multidirectional verbs of motion in any tense to indicate repeated round trips. For example, в прошлом году я часто ездила в Киев. Last year, I frequently went to Kiev. I made multiple round trips to Kiev, so I use ездить in the past tense. Or я хожу в библиотеку каждый день. I go to the library every day. Repeated round trips, so we're using a multidirectional verb of motion, хожу. Or in the future, в следующем году мы будем несколько раз ездить в Россию. Next year, we will go to Russia several times. We're going to make repeated round trips in the future, so we use a multidirectional verb of motion, ездить. We also use these multidirectional verbs of motion for general motion or aimless motion, motion with no goal, or motion that is just being done for the sake of motion. For example, я плаваю каждый день. I swim every day. There's no indication of where you swim to, and you're not swimming anywhere. You're probably swimming laps at the pool or something. So we use a multidirectional verb of motion. Я плаваю каждый день. Or я часто бегаю. I run frequently. I go running often. Again, there's no goal whatsoever mentioned. You're just engaging in the motion in order to engage in the motion. Therefore, we use бегать, a multidirectional verb of motion. Or ребенок уже ходит. The child is already walking. The child can already walk. There's no specific goal. The child is just walking in general, and therefore we use ходить, a multidirectional verb of motion. So there you have it. I hope you found that helpful. It's a pretty basic, but I think useful breakdown of when to use the different types of motion, unidirectional versus multidirectional. And so if you keep these tips in mind, it will make it a lot easier to decide when to use which verb.